The Congressional Budget Office has just released its report on the health care bill passed by the House earlier this month. Let's get to NBC's Casey Hunt, who we just can't quit on Capitol Hill.
Hi, Nicole. We do have breaking news here with this CBO report, as expected, late this afternoon. So the initial top line, we had been talking about whether or not the House may have made some errors in this bill and would need to have another dramatic floor vote. That is not the case based on this CBO score. This estimate says that it will save about $119 billion over the course of 10 years. They needed that number to be more than $2 billion, so they've cleared that threshold easily. This will allow them to send the bill to the Senate and proceed to the next steps. But there are still some numbers in here that are a little different from what we knew before this. The original version of this bill had been scored, and of course they voted on this new tweaked version without having this information. They say here that 23 million Americans would lose insurance under this bill compared to current law. Previously they had said 24 million people would lose insurance. One thing I do think is worth pointing out, they do make a distinction, the CBO, between people who would live in states where these essential health benefits and other key parts of Obamacare would remain in place, and states where they potentially would waive all of those requirements. You remember that was the major change that Republicans made to help get the Freedom Caucus, those conservative members, on board. They said, okay, states, you can opt out of these key things if you show that you can cover people in another way. The other thing that the CBO says here is that they're very doubtful that states can actually cover people in another way, that they believe, according to this report, that those with pre-existing conditions would be ultimately unable to purchase health insurance at premiums that are about what they face under current law. Essentially, that if you have a pre-existing condition and you live in a state that waives these requirements, it's likely that your premium would skyrocket. Now, the other piece of news that Republicans were looking for was an overall decrease in premiums, and the CBO does estimate that those premiums for people in states that don't waive these requirements and that continue under kind of the Obamacare-style system, that those premiums would decline by about 4% over the course of 10 years by 2026. But the challenge is that we would return a little bit, according to the CBO, to the way things were before. So if you're younger and healthier, you're paying much less. If you're older and you're sicker, you're paying a lot more. Those are some of the key tenets here in this law that would allow insurance companies to adjust premiums on a wider range than they can right now. So on the whole, again, this allows Republicans to move forward. This allows the Senate to start writing this bill. But at the end of the day, these metrics not necessarily dramatically different from the ones we saw before.
All right, Casey Hunt doing double duty for us. Thank you, Casey. Steph, thanks. Is this a relief for Republicans? The wheels of legislation grind on, or is this a political loser?
It depends on what Republican you are. If you're one in the Senate, you're going, damn, now it's my turn. I mean, I think, yes, the fact that they don't have to go back to the drawing board is somewhat of a positive. But remember where we're coming from and how difficult this is. This isn't a disastrous situation by any means, but they got a long way to go.
Joel, does the political ad write itself that Republican, I mean, it used to be that we pushed grannies off the hill. Elise and I are used to defending ourselves from those attacks that people like you lobbed at us. But this is still 23 million people losing health care. That's serious if you've got a sick kid or someone with that.
And here's another number that's in there that no one is highlighting yet, is that by 2026, we'll have 50 million people under the age of 65 uninsured in America. That's 9 years away. That's going to sound like tomorrow to a lot of people when that number gets injected, that 50 million Americans will be without insurance. I think Stephanie's right. I think the Senate thinks their migraine headache just got a lot worse, and they actually now have to do something. Now, on the flip side of that, you know, if Paul Ryan can actually exert some leadership and get moderates and conservatives to act like responsible legislators, you might be able to make some headway and some progress here. And make this work.
Yeah, the Senate doesn't want to deal with this. No one wants to deal with this. They can't do tax reform until they get it fixed. Here's the thing.
Because they don't have the money, right?
Right, because they don't have the money. 23 million, 24 million, that is a death knell for the midterm elections. And everyone knew that the Republicans were going to make it cheaper. That's what they always promised. There was no doubt that they were going to make sure that they could get this under their budget. But the idea is, if you cannot increase coverage, or if you're going to throw people off their health insurance, no matter how you try and spin it, they're going to vote you out next year. And unless they they decide that they're not going to kick this thing in until after the midterms, they're all going to suffer terrible consequences.
Elise Jordan, how do you defend a Republican up for election in the midterms from what Jason just...
This is actually better than I expected from the CBO, because they do have a substantial savings of $119 billion, and it wasn't looking that way in previous estimates of the prior plan. And so I think that you kind of get one of two on this. You've got Republicans who see this money, that's the health care and how it's hemorrhaging, and then you've got Republicans who are concerned about letting 23 million out of their coverage. So you get one or the other. It's at least one with this, whereas previously they got neither.
All right. Just hitting pause here. We're going to keep this going, but joining us now from Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Jackie Speier from the House Intelligence Committee. We're going to pull you into double duty, as we do everybody that stumbles into our 4 o'clock hour. First, any reaction on the CBO numbers about the Republican health care bill?
Well, the stunning number is that 23 million Americans will lose their health insurance. And the pre-existing condition issue is still very real, because in the end, you are going to be able to get health insurance, but it's going to cost so much more. And that's why so many people with pre-existing condition do not have health insurance before the Affordable Care Act came into being. So it's still problematic. I would say, though, that depending on when the Republicans actually put this on the president's desk, could hurt them in midterms or not hurt them in midterms, depending on when it actually lands there.
Congresswoman, is there any, when you all get together behind closed doors, when no Republicans and no reporters can see you, is there any irony in how popular Republicans made Obamacare, that you just shrug your shoulders and say, well,
you know, especially since we voted 66 times, I believe, over the course of 4 years to repeal it. I mean, there were 66 efforts by the Republicans to repeal it outright. And now they're finding it very difficult to repeal it because they're hearing from their constituents. And I can't begin to tell you what my constituents say. I mean, I have some mothers that have followed me around from town hall to town hall saying, you can't do this. My son has asthma, and we would have lost our house if we didn't have the Affordable Care Act when he was born. I mean, there are really traumatized people out there. And I think we're hearing that across the country.
I've heard that in some of my reporting, too. But we've called you on here to ask you about today's, the story that we led with, your committee's call to subpoena Mike Flynn's business records. What are you looking for?
Well, we're looking for evidence that he's lied. We're looking for evidence that he has not complied with the law. And all of that will factor into why. What was he trying to cover up?
Are you personally still open to granting him immunity? I know the Senate Intelligence Committee has taken that off the table, but we heard from Congressman Schiff that might be an open question. What are your personal views on immunity for Mike Flynn if he dishes?
Well, I think the real question is, what is he going to offer us that will help us get to the bottom of this horrific circumstance? I mean, not only did we have the Russians interfering with our election on a level we have never, ever seen. And we now have this potential that the Trump campaign personnel was engaged with the Russians. So to the extent that he can help us shed light on that second component that Director Jim Comey, when he was the director of the FBI, was pursuing, that would really tell whether or not we would grant him immunity or not.
What do you think Mike Flynn is hiding? Do you think he's covering up for the president? We know he wasn't truthful in his background forms. We know he took money from Russia without disclosing it. But on the more serious issue that you just talked about, the ties with Russia, what do you think he knows, and who do you think he's protecting?
Well, that's the $800 million question, I guess. We do know that the president went out of his way to try and interfere with the investigation. He really wanted the investigation of Mike Flynn to come to a close. We do know that Mike Flynn said that he has a story to tell. You link those two together and you could, I guess conspiracy theorists could suggest that there is something there. We just don't know yet, and that's what we need to find out.
Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your time, and we're grateful to have you. When we come back, we're going to check in with the traveling White House.